So thank you, Dr. Woody, and thank you, Dr. Martin, for joining us and helping us understand what these three very difficult subjects are. So the first question we have is, first, if you could define for us what depression, anxiety, and grief are and how they are viewed in the church.
Well, we're obviously talking about things outside of here because Christians don't have those, right? Good, we cleared that. Depression, it depends on the severity of it. Depression kind of sucks the life out of you. I think everybody has a sense of what depression is because you can describe it and you can see when your friends are. There's a lot of levels to depression. And it's caused, could be genetically, it could be chemical going on. It also could be situational. You can have situational kind of urgent depressions, which gets confused with anxiety and grief. They all kind of get confused sometimes. That's why it's hard to define them exactly. But with depression, like I said, life is just sucked out and no motivation. It's when you want to pull the covers over your head and just, okay. There are different kinds of that. There's your chronic depression. There's your situational, as I said. There's SAD, seasonal affective disorder, which is depression that's affected by sunlight. So some people get sad as the seasons get change into winter and we see less sun. So that's an aspect. So there's different things that cause depression. One of the things that I'd like to just throw in here is adverse childhood experiences. So those would be situational things. When you grow up in a context that is not optimal, it has long-term effects also that can kind of predispose you to going toward depression. So that's something else to consider. Anxiety is it's kind of like geared up. It's almost related to a fight or flight reaction because there's a tension involved in that. I was going to say there's anxiety involved in it. It's nervousness. It's anticipation of bad things. So it's not unusual for depressed people to also feel anxious. And when you struggle with anxiety a lot, you feel depressed about it. So there's a little difference in there. Anxiety there is a state of anxiety that's called generalized anxiety disorder where you just feel anxious all the time. Some anxiety is really normal. In fact, we have it appropriately. It's good to be anxious before a test because then you study. You see what I mean?
Hopefully.
Well, sometimes they do. Okay. Anyway, so that's the idea, and it can be very useful, but if it's long going, then there are ways of dealing with it.
Thank you. So grief also is a part of the same complex issue: depression, anxiety, and grief. So one of the ways I'd like to describe it is just to give you a scenario. Envision that a family of 5 are together, a family that is thriving, a family that is very active, 3 children, a husband and a wife. The wife is at home. The husband is everywhere but at home, working, just always. And then there is a serious illness diagnosis, a serious and tragic death, if you will, in that household. And then there are 3 children who are 21, 16, and 8. And that is the end of that story, as the wife is at home and an at-home mother for over 15 years, and now this has happened. Does that seem like a situation to grieve over? That was my situation, ladies and gentlemen, when my husband passed in 2004. And so the issue then is, what on earth do we do? How can I change? What should be the next step? And so when you think about grief, is it a situation where you can't go on, a situation where you want to go on? Now are we back in this situation with anxiety and and depression, thinking about all of the things that have to happen going forward, what do? Do I cover my head? Do I take pills? Do I do something to take myself out? And the answer is no, because the children are what? 21, 16, and 8. You have to get up. So grief is the situation, and there are 5 stages of grief, and I'll quickly go through them if I could now. Do you want me to do that? All right, so there are 5 stages of grief, and the first one is denial. How many people are in denial? The end of the semester is here. Those papers that you haven't written, they have to be done. And not only that, that reading report that you are looking at to see how can I stretch what I read, you're in denial. Then there is anger. Why is there anger? Because you just didn't have time to get to those books. But now they're staring at you and talking to you, and you haven't read them. Anger. You're angry. All right, so that is the next step. And then you move on into bargaining. If I just do this, Lord, if you just stretch and give me more grace than you have given me in the past, I promise I'm going to do better next semester, and I'm going to read better. And after that, that 4th stage is depression. The depression that Dr. Martin has already talked about, that sadness, the reality that sets in. If I don't do the reading, I'm not going to pass this class. And if I don't pass this class, I have to repeat it. And then finally, acceptance. You get to the point where you have to accept the situation that you're in, knowing that there's going to be a new normal or a new reality.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes. So can you guys answer this question? How do we combat the stigma or taboo nature of dealing with depression, anxiety, and grief in the church? In other words, how can we halt the tendency to over-spiritualize our solutions to dealing with depression, anxiety, and grief?
Can you start? Okay, so one of the things we need to do is we need to recognize that we have a misunderstanding about our role in church. Since we're here at Dallas Theological Seminary, what problems could we possibly have? So we go into the church, even though we have all those, the anxious feelings, the depression that we're taking in, but we get out of our cars and we walk in the building and we're blessed and we're happy in Jesus and we just want to be there. We don't have a realistic view of why we are going to church. Church is a community of believers where we're supposed to lean on each other. We study the Bible here. We know what Hebrews 10, 24, and 25 talk about. We are here to be in fellowship and relationship, but we don't feel we can share our problems. What I'm suggesting is when you go into church and into your community, it's more than just sitting in the building and sitting in a row and recognizing the people to your left and right when the pastor says, or the worship leader says, hug the person next to you. Most of us don't want to even touch the person next to us, let alone hug the person next to us. So I'm suggesting that you have to have a sense of community. If you go to a large church, make it smaller. You want a few people who you can confide in. Don't be in a community in the church and you don't talk to a pastor or a member of that staff, someone you can speak to.
It's we forget that we're in a fallen world and a broken world, and that our bodies also get broken and our feelings get broken, and we deal with things. And it's not because we've fallen out of faith with the Lord. And I've heard more friends and clients talk about struggling and what they're given as a verse, as if that took care of it. So I would say, first, take away the shame and the guilt for having and struggling with anxiety or depression. Don't start blaming, like, aren't you having a quiet time long enough, or what is the problem here?
No faith.
No faith. There's no faith. You wouldn't have depression if you had faith. And so I think Dr. Harris is going to deal with that well. And so take away the shame and the guilt so that we can talk honestly with one another and be encouraged, and because that's just the truth of the way it is.
It is.
Yeah.
So we have a laundry list of questions that are really, really good, but we're going to close with one of them, and that is, can you tell us a little bit about depression among women and minorities?
So one of the things that women do, they tend to, men and women are different. We all know that, right? But one of the things that women do is they tend to bear the weight of their family, their jobs, their relationships, and everything that goes on in their environment on their shoulders. How broad are the shoulders? I don't see any pads on anyone's shoulders here, on any of the women here. There are no pads. So if you're carrying the weight of all of it on your shoulders, it's going to be too heavy. Keep the visual in your minds when you leave here today. You can't carry everything that you've had in your life on your shoulders. But secondly, add the added stress of being a minority in a majority world where there are additional stressors, economic stressors, perhaps discrimination stressors, perhaps there are other stressors that you add to that, and even to some degree, gender stressors. So let's wrap it all up. I'll tell you, I have a lot of stressors here. So I'm a minority. I'm a seasoned and mature minority. How about that? But not only that, that's also true, but also a single mom, and also a mom who has worked in the workplace. What I am suggesting is that community is the best way to help in all of those things. And oh, by the way, women are a little bit more sensitive than the men. The men are more broad brushed typically. So ladies, don't write me on my email to say that I was being critical. I'm not being critical, just actually stating a fact. There's some battles we just can't win. We have to let it go. So one of the things that even throughout my whole journey after my husband passed that I had to deal with even for myself was to challenge my children to look for every opportunity to see God's grace operating in our lives, to go into the scriptures, to go deep down and to search where we are in life, and to see that Ephesians 1:3-7, we all know it. I don't need to read it to you, but we know that we are recipients of blessings that come down from heaven. Don't ever dismiss that thought or that truth, and don't ever forget it, even in the midst of your late night reading next week.
Let me just what's the word I want?
Concur.
Piggyback, that was the word I almost said. I'll go with that. With men and women. Women tend to internalize, and so women's depressions tend to go into a sense of worthlessness and guilt and, our failures, and that's the way it manifests in we women. With men, it's more typical to be irritable, acting out, more externalizing their depression and restlessness, anger, those kind of ways. We do things differently. But otherwise, I piggyback on everything you said. How's that?
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Woody and Dr. Martin. We really appreciate you guys giving us some insight into these very important topics. And you guys need to ask these ladies questions when you see them around. They're incredibly wise and incredibly helpful. And both of these women have challenged me in ways that I've never realized I've needed challenging. So get to know them if you can. But thank you.
Thank you. You're amazing.
This is Dr. Hall Harris. He was my Greek 3 and 4 professor, and I'm sure he's been a blessing to many of you, just as he has to me. He's been a champion for me, and so he lives with depression, and he has a way of expressing his depression. It doesn't come out in anger. It doesn't come out in the expressiveness that we kind of just listen to. It comes out in creative writing. And so he's going to stand before us today, and he's going to express the depression's black hole.
Okay, I'm going to read a poem that was written on August 19th of last year, 2016. And we'll say more about my background in a few minutes, but this one is called Depression's Black Hole. Wine dark the sea, and darker still the night. No stars at all, The moon is down and closed for business, shuttered till the morn. Sky with dark matter filled, the darkened corners of my mind unpierced by any liquid light at all. My eyes reflecting pools of utter nothingness. My soul is blacker still. Night was the loser in this competition. My cats, once gray, are black and large and angry, biting, snarling, hissing, scratching, ripping me apart from outside in, flaying skin, black blood congealing on the sand, and total emptiness within. This too will pass. Or will it? Just because it has before guarantees exactly nothing. Caught in self's clutches, gravity well of my desperate psyche, there is no escape. My options are at an end. I must throw myself on infinite mercy and pray for day to come again. But there are no guarantees.
So let's just sit there for a moment. Many times we throw Christianese around, and many times we have the answer to everything. And so when I was informed that my professor, who is a brilliant, amazing, brilliant man, lives with, well, you are, lives with depression, for me, I hope that it would be a testament to those of us who live on this campus. So, Dr. Harris, your poems, all of the poems, and you can go to his website, he has a website. Your poems usually don't give us an answer to depression or to the life that you live. And so my question to you is, your poems speak to despair and end without a hope or an answer. Speak to how the church enters into grief and depression from the perspective of one who lives with it.
That's a tall order. First, let me give a disclaimer. Not all the poetry I write is about depression, and there are some that are blacker than this. I gave Jarita about 10 maybe and let her pick 2 for me to read. So she picked the 2 she liked the best. So I just wanted to say that. I write poetry about other things as well. The church, in my own personal experience, has not really done a very good job of engaging depression in any meaningful way, but part of that is a result of what Doctors Woody and Martin were talking about a few minutes ago. Namely, the church doesn't really want to acknowledge in many cases that it's even an issue. And that goes for people in the church and people who lead the church. Because we all kind of want to pretend that we're all perfect people, right? We've got our spiritual act together, we've got our physical act together, well, most of us, and we've got our psychological act together and our emotions together, and we're all just, fine. So what then do we go to church for? It's kind of a mutual admiration society. I mean, I wonder sometimes. But I speak as a person who has dealt with depression. I'm now 65, And I think it started probably sometime as a pre-adolescent, so I'm going to say around 10 years old or so. And that's just my conscious awareness of unhappiness with who I was, with how I looked, with who my parents were, with the environment I was brought up in, and virtually everything else about my life. And the reason for that is I come from a line of depressed people. You may recall, I think it was Dr. Martin said maybe 40% has a genetic component to it. Well, I got it from both sides of my family. My paternal grandmother, my father's mother, was depressive in the 1950s and 60s. And I can remember as an 8 to 10-year-old going in to her bedroom and finding her curled up under the covers, facing the wall, refusing to get out of bed in the middle of the afternoon because she felt so terrible. And there was only one medication back in those days that they even had for depression, and it did not work for her. So she underwent ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, better known as shock therapy. And I can remember as a kid thinking about the idea of running all this electricity through the brain, through the head of my grandmother, and what in the world is this doing? But it was keeping her alive. My grandfather was known for binge drinking. He would disappear for long periods of time with his drinking buddies, just go somewhere, hunting cabin, I don't know, and binge drink and get drunk. And then he would show back up. And this was just the pattern. On my mother's side of the family, my mother lost her father when she was 12 years old in the middle of the Depression. And there were 5 siblings. She was the next to youngest. And her mother, my maternal grandmother, kept that family together through the Depression by sheer, unadulterated force of will. But it made for a very harsh, hard person who was difficult to get along with. And my mother was so impacted by that sense of loss and hurt and grief that the rest of her life, she had real trouble letting go of people and letting go of things. And she became very paranoid and very depressed and a closet alcoholic, from which she died when I was already married and teaching in seminary in my early 30s. And so I got the genes for alcoholism and depression, both. And it's taken me, I have been in and out of therapy, on and off medication for practically ever since my 10 to 12-year-old period of exploring this. And the reason when you look at me, you don't see a depressed person, you see somebody who's pretty laid back, pretty easygoing, pushover is a grader for the most part, who's always trying to please everybody. By the way, that's kind of not a major marker, but trying to please everybody so they'll like you is a factor. But I have what's known as smiling depression, and that's really for real. There have been articles just this year in Psychology Today that talk about it. What it is you burn up all this energy when you're in public to maintain the facade that you're okay, everything's fine, happy, great, I got everything under control. Hey, look, I'm cool. I can crack jokes with the best of them. I can smile with the best of them. Most of you look at me that way because that's what I actually clown around in class sometimes. And you look and you say, can't be depressed. No way. But that's because you're seeing the public persona. I go home where my wife has been sitting all day waiting. Thank you, Ursula. She's here. Sitting all day waiting for me to come home to interact with her, and I collapse in a chair or on the couch in a funk, and I don't want to be bothered. I don't want to have anything to do with, I want to retreat. because I've used all my emotional energy in public, and now in private, I'm a loner, I'm an introvert, I'm withdrawn, I want to hide. And I do the same thing at church and every other public thing I do. And so that's the story of my life. I've written poetry since I was a teenager. Most of it back then was pretty awful, so I'm not ever going to drag any of that out again. But a couple of years ago, due to a whole number of new events coming into my life, including beginning to teach some media arts courses and becoming friends with Dr. Basselin, I started writing poetry again, and I realized suddenly that the emotions I had denied to therapist after therapist that I even had, I don't have emotions. Oh, yes, you do. All human beings have emotions. No, I don't. I don't have emotions. Every human being has emotions. You have emotions. They're just so deeply buried you don't know it.
Okay,
I started
one
writing poetry, and the poetry became a vehicle for me to express those emotions. And that's why I do it. One of my email taglines says, I rotate them, so you may not have gotten an email from me with this on there recently. Writing poetry is the most spiritual thing I do. Because for me, it is. It gets me in touch with God, myself, and the emotions I denied having for years and years.
So from 11:16 to 11:17, could you wrap up how
Boy, that's precise.
I just wanted to part of having this particular chapel in December was because of SAD, the seasonal affective disorder that a lot of us walk through. How did you come to terms with sharing your depression with your colleagues, those who you work side by side with, and what was the response?
I'm not sure how many I've shared it with, actually. There are a few. Dr. Martin is an old friend. I knew her at Fellowship Bible Church before I actually met my wife, so we're talking 35 plus years. Dr. Basselin, Dr. Barnes, Chaplain Joe's known about it for 6 months or a year. But I don't make a big deal about it. It just depends if it comes up. I'm not wearing it on my sleeve.
Sure.
But I will say this. I'm trying to keep it to a minute. It's the best I can do. I'm from North Carolina. I tell stories. If I talk about the big rain last week, I start with Noah's Ark and work forward.
This is how he is in class too, and it's so funny.
I know. But my door is always open.
Yeah.
One of the things that made me decide to want to say what I'm saying here today is last spring, within a month, I had about 5 students in my office sitting down telling me that either they or their spouses were seriously depressed. And I was thinking, you need to talk to Dr. Barnes, Dr. Martin, Dr. Woody, somebody, not me. But they felt like they could talk to me about it because I had dropped hints in class here and there. And one of them in the past, their spouse had even attempted suicide. And I just felt there's got to be, and then I started checking with my friends in psychology and in the department, the counseling department. Yeah, we tend to have that population here. We tend to be a little over the top with obsessive compulsiveness. That's another factor in depression. Talk about perfectionism. Ask my wife. Oh my goodness. I'm less than I used to be, but when our kids were young, they're now in their late 20s, our car was off limits for food and drink. You know, because I didn't want a messed up car. So, you know, just that's an example.
So thank you so much, Dr. Harris. We speak to this, and I wanted to be inclusive. This is, and I can say this with Dr. Harris. He's a white male who's privileged in our particular culture. And so when we think through as leaders, especially if you're planting multicultural churches, if you're working in multicultural context, take into consideration the minority population in your church. Take into consideration the women that are in your church. As leaders, as pastors, see how you can welcome counseling onto your staff. so that people like us have a place to go that's safe and that's clinically proven to help those of us walk through the depression that we all walk through. Living in a racialized society brings about post-traumatic syndrome for people who are Black, and we have to make sure that as leaders in our churches that we give the opportunity to help us heal, all of us heal together. So thank you, Dr. Harris. I appreciate you. He's going to leave you with one of the poems that I thought was really, really wonderful because it talked about longing for darkness.
The title is Loving Darkness, ? We are surrounded by spirituality. We just aren't equipped with the right sensor suite to detect it. I've been told I must embrace the light and eschew darkness all my life. Infelicitous Johannine polarizations. Hate the darkness, shun it, flee, run as fast as can. And yet I find in me this strange attraction for the shadow. What hand or eye framed my twisted symmetry? The night few terrors holds for me and covers all my woe with cloak of gray, so that my cats are all alike, as is my burning tiger, whose symmetry, unlike mine, is frightful, not perverse. If I abandon my beloved night, then I must strip my armor off, lay down my shield's defensitivity, ground my weapons, walk unaided, naked into day, leaving my shame and solitude behind for once and all. Can this be done? My self-deception makes it sound so easy, but I can testify on stubborn oath it isn't. My eyes are not attuned to such delirious brightness. Pain shoves out longing at the last, and once again, I'm back to darkness, hiding where I once began.
Thank you very much for that. My name is Daniel Walbert. Familiar face as many of you. I definitely understood what you meant when you talked about having a kind of a smiling diagnosis. I feel that that has been my own experience. And as I look back on my whole life and my long-term walk with depression, I used to call it a battle, but feels like I kind of lost, right? It just sort of never made any progress, and I found a way to live around it and kind of live through it and even live on top of it. And so I'm up here today just to quickly share a little bit of my experience with what that's felt like and how I've managed it and how I've found hope even around it. And so when I was younger, I felt this sense of numbness set in. And it wasn't necessarily a constant sense of tragedy, which is what I had thought depression was, but it was an inability to have a really good day. And I remember that kicked in around 13, 14, 15, and by the time I was in the middle of high school, what seemed to be a month of sadness had prolonged into a year. And as those months began to stack up, I tried to trace it and track it down to being particular events that seemed to have gone wrong. But as I thought further and further back, I couldn't find the beginning of the season. I couldn't even think about what the end of it would be. And so my experience has been one not of acute, tragic moments, but of a long numbness. And as I've responded to the call of the Lord in my life to walk into ministry and to help other people, one of the things that has been difficult about that is I have thought, how is it that I am supposed to be in pastoral ministry? How is it that I am supposed to really help somebody in a moment of counseling if I myself cannot hear and cannot see? And one thing that I've done, which I don't know if this is the right thing to do, but it's definitely an outworking of it, is I have doubled down on what it is that I can know. Because if I can't feel and I can't see, and I'm kind of walking through my house in the dark by memory so often in my spiritual life, I have doubled down on the things that I can know, and I would find myself buried in my office, buried in my study, reading book after book after book. And what's funny in the church is that they encourage you to do that because they think that that's going to make you a leader. And so they say, hey, you know, great, here's another book to read, here's another book to read. And before you know it, the books were my only friends. And I think some of you have been in seasons in your life where that was true. And yet the church still encouraged it because they assumed that if my lexical ability went up and my ability to comprehend things went up, then eventually I would be somebody that they could rely upon as a leader. And that was ultimately pretty damaging, and it's something that I still have to combat today and still have to peel that away and to fight back that sense of numbness. And so one of the things that I think that the Lord has done as I've lived with a prolonged sense of this numbness and of this depression, and I've gone in and out of counseling, again, been on and off of medication, worked on public speaking skills, learned all of the right things I needed to do to be successful in an evangelical culture, gonna win. But ultimately what I learned is that I needed a God who would come through completely without me. Because as I looked at myself and I said, there's going to be a day, in fact today is the day, when I know that inside of me I absolutely do not have what it's going to take to get this done. I cannot really be who these people really need me to be. So God is going to have to really act independent of me to really help them. And as I've relied upon God to be that way, he has been that way. And as I've seen him do that for other people through ministry that I've participated in, I'm gaining the confidence that he's going to do that for me, even as I am living in a state of numbness almost all the time. And so I don't know if that's a resolution or an answer for you if you find yourself in a similar position, but do know that God has acted independent of how you feel, and that he will act independent of how you feel. And even if you feel incompetent, the Lord is going to be competent on your behalf. Okay? So continue to walk forward with him in that.
So thank you for being here. We appreciate it. We searched high and low for students to share their story, and it was very difficult to do that. And so if you don't want to share it on the stage, we completely understand. But my hope and our prayer, student council, is that you share it with someone who you trust and someone who can help you walk through this.